So there was some really interesting astronomical news that came out recently, with really big implications for future human colonization of the Red Planet. To give you some context, let's start with NASA and their Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, also called MRO. This orbiter was equipped with a plethora of sensors and cameras, including a device called the Shallow Radar, or SHARAD. The SHARAD emits radar waves that can penetrate dense surfaces, like the ground, and gather useful information almost 2.5 kilometers below the surface. Some scientists from the University of Texas at Austin and the University of Arizona used this SHARAD to gather data from Mars's northern polar regions. What they saw was incredible. They found massive ice sheets spanning the northern regions, about 1.5 kilometers underground. In the news articles put out by the University of Texas, they claimed that this much water, if melted, would cover Mars in 1.5 meters or about 5 feet of liquid water. Although this is just to help visualize it. In reality, a lot of this ice is at no risk of melting. The lead author of the study was graduate researcher Stefano Nerazi, who said, quote, "We didn't expect to find this much water ice here. That likely makes it the third largest water reservoir on Mars after the polar ice caps," unquote. They found that the ice sheets were deposited in layers, alternating between ice and basaltic sand. This tracks with the precessional rotation of Mars. As Mars orbits the Sun, its rotational axis goes through a precessional wobble. Now, without going too deep into these astrophysical details, this wobble takes place over the course of a 50,000-year cycle, and it makes Mars's ice caps expand and retreat, like superseasonal ice formation. When Mars is at a point in this precessional cycle where its ice cover retreats, or appears to retreat, layers of sand are being deposited on older layers, protecting them from the sun and preserving them to some degree. And when the ice cover expands at some later point in the cycle, it covers this deposited basaltic sand with a new layer of ice, and so on and so forth across time and countless precessional cycles. The end result is a massive series of ice sheets in the northern polar region. And according to the study's co-author, Professor Jack Holt at the University of Arizona, quote, "The total volume of water locked up in these buried polar deposits is roughly the same as all the water ice known to exist in glaciers and buried ice layers at lower latitudes on Mars, and they are approximately the same age," unquote. Mr. Nerazi said, quote, "Understanding how much water was available globally versus what's trapped in the poles is important if you're going to have liquid water on Mars. You can have all the right conditions for life, but if most of the water is locked up at the poles, then it becomes difficult to have sufficient amounts of liquid water near the equator," unquote. The point of having water near the equator is that it's the warmest place on Mars. It's warmest near the equatorial regions. And when you're coming into Mars orbit from a spaceship, it's so much easier to land your astronauts closer to the equator than closer to the poles. So the equator is where human colonization is most likely going to be, or at least where it's most likely going to get started. But even though this polar ice is far away in the northern polar regions, it's still super exciting for another reason. A lot of the ice discovered in the southern areas and the equatorial areas with the same SHARAD device as used in this study, well, a lot of that southern ice is mixed with rock and sand, and it can't really be chipped off like an ice block and melted down for drinking water. It'll have to be melted and then extracted or purified, or the mineral sediment somehow removed before it can be drinkable, and that process can be tedious and energy intensive. But the good news is that this newly discovered northern ice sheet is 62 to 88% water ice, and in some areas it's up to 90% water ice, which would suggest that it's much purer ice than what can be found in the lower latitudes. Thus, this polar ice sheet can be harvested and used for drinking water with a lot less effort. That can be critical for any potential Martian colonies. If we can get easy access to clean water in situ on Mars, then the probability of a theoretical Martian colony being viable and self-sufficient becomes much, much higher.